How does one of the most embarrassing weapon failures in military history become the secret to winning a war? It sounds like a paradox, doesn't it? But what if I told you this story is more than just a history lesson? Think of it as a blueprint, a detailed schematic that shows how two powerful empires, both totally convinced of their own superiority, went head-to-head, and how one side's greatest weakness was completely misread by the other, leading to one of the most lopsided victories in naval history. This is about how to lose a war you are absolutely sure you're winning, and its lessons about arrogance and failure are maybe more relevant today than you'd think.
Okay, let's dive right in with this quote because it just perfectly sums up the whole crazy situation. For the first 2 years of the Pacific War, Japanese intelligence was looking at the American submarine force and honestly probably feeling a little sorry for them. They saw torpedoes that were duds, torpedoes that ran wild, torpedoes that just sailed harmlessly under their ships. And they thought, wow, these guys are incompetent. But they were so wrong. What they were actually watching was maybe the most painful, high-stakes product debugging session in history. They weren't seeing failure, they were seeing a lesson being learned in steel and blood. And because they couldn't see that, they sealed their own fate.
So to really unpack this whole blueprint, we're going to break it down into 5 parts. First, we'll look at the weapons themselves. Then, the deadly price both sides paid for thinking they were the smartest guys in the room. We'll track the agonizing process of fixing a totally broken system. See the terrifying result when it finally worked, and then, at the end, we'll tie it all back to why this stuff still matters right now in our world.
At the start of the war, you had Japan and the United States, and both felt pretty good about their naval tech. I mean, they both thought they had the ultimate weapon to control the seas. The real problem wasn't just in the engineering, though. It was in how they saw each other. It was like they were looking at a mirror, but they only saw their own strengths. And when they looked at their opponent, all they saw was a distorted caricature, shaped by their own prejudices.
Now look at these numbers. They don't just tell you about technical specs, they tell a story of total dominance. On the left, you've got Japan's Type 93, the Longlands. This thing, it was a ghost. It ran on pure oxygen, which means it left no wake, no trail of bubbles. It could hit a target from over 11 miles away with a half-ton warhead. It was a phantom that could kill you from over the horizon. Now compare that to the American Mark 14. It was like a clumsy brawler. Its steam engine left this huge, obvious trail of bubbles pointing right back to the sub that fired it, and its range was just a fraction of the Long Lance's. On paper, it wasn't even a contest. The Long Lance was the undisputed champ.
So, faced with a weapon that was clearly light years ahead, you'd think the US Navy would be panicking, right? Nope, not at all. And this quote tells you exactly why. In 1940, US intelligence was literally handed the detailed plans for the Long Lance. They knew what it was. But when the Bureau of Ordnance, the people in charge of all naval weapons, looked at the plans, they basically laughed them off. Their official assessment was the shocking mix of arrogance and barely hidden racism. The idea that Japanese engineers could solve the incredibly dangerous problem of stabilizing pure oxygen. To them, it was just impossible. They filed the report away, and that one arrogant decision would end up sentencing thousands of American sailors to death.
But here's the thing, this blindness, it wasn't a one-way street. The Japanese looked at American technology and saw the exact same thing, a flawed, inferior rival. This symmetrical arrogance, this mutual contempt, it was about to have devastating consequences for both sides, but in chillingly different ways.
For the Allies, the price was paid almost immediately, in fire and twisted steel. In the chaotic night battles of 1942, like the Battle of Savo Island, Allied commanders did what they were trained to do. They positioned their ships just outside the 5-mile range of their own torpedoes, thinking they were safe. And then, out of the darkness, from twice that distance, came the Long Lances they were told were impossible. The cruisers Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria were just slaughtered in minutes. Over 3,100 sailors died because a committee in Washington, D.C. had decided what their enemy was capable of, and they were dead wrong. So while American cruisers were getting sunk by a superior torpedo, American submariners were living their own special kind of hell. Imagine it. You're deep in enemy waters, risking it all, and your weapon is a ghost. It just doesn't work. Think about being Commander Tier Jacobs. You line up the perfect shot on a Japanese convoy. It's a dream target. You fire your entire combat load, 24 torpedoes, and you just watch, helpless, as every single one sails perfectly true right under the enemy ships. His report back to base was just seething with rage, and the response from the Bureau of Ordnance? They basically told him he was doing it wrong. They questioned his math, his crew, his nerve. It couldn't possibly be the torpedo, they said. It had to be him. And this is where the arrogance becomes perfectly symmetrical. The Japanese were watching all of this happen. They were literally pulling duds out of the sides of their ships. They heard the furious American radio messages, and they put two and two together and came to a conclusion that was completely logical and completely fatally wrong. They decided the American torpedo was junk and their crews were incompetent. And because of that, they figured their huge merchant fleet didn't need much protection from subs. They were a minor threat. They saw all the symptoms, but they totally misdiagnosed the disease.
This question just tore the U.S. submarine force apart for almost 2 full years. Was it just bad luck? Were the crews really that bad? Or was this pinnacle of American technology a complete and utter failure? The guys on the front lines, they knew the answer. But their voices were just drowned out by the institutional pride of the bureaucracy back home. A bureaucracy that just refused to believe its perfect weapon could possibly be flawed.
You know, the change didn't come from Washington. It came from guys in the field. Leaders like Admiral Charles Lockwood in the Pacific, who finally decided, I'm going to trust my men. The breaking point was an incident with the submarine USS Tynosa. It fired 15 torpedoes at a huge beached tanker that wasn't even moving. It was a perfect test. 11 of them hit square on and did nothing. They were duds. Lockwood knew right then this wasn't operator error. This was proof. So he defied the Bureau of Ordnance and started his own brutal testing, firing torpedoes into cliffs in Hawaii until he finally uncovered the truth.
And what they found was an absolute nightmare. It wasn't one flaw, it was 3, and each one was masking the others. First, the torpedo always ran 10 feet deeper than you set it. Why? Because during the Great Depression, to save money, they only tested it with a cheap practice warhead filled with water, not the much heavier live one. Second, its fancy magnetic exploder, which was designed in Rhode Island, went completely haywire in the different magnetic fields near the equator. And the third flaw, this one was the most infuriating of all, the contact detonator. If you hit the target perfectly, at a 90-degree angle, the torpedo was going so fast that the firing pin would actually buckle and jam. The only way it worked was if you got a sloppy, glancing hit. It was a weapon that literally punished you for being perfect. And this is where the solution comes from, and it's just brilliant. After 21 months of this hell, they finally figured out the fixes. They just disabled the faulty magnetic exploders. They told the crews to set the depth to 0. And for that jamming firing pin, in this incredible twist of irony, the fix came from the very enemy they had so arrogantly underestimated. Engineers found that if they used a lighter aluminum alloy, one they reverse-engineered from the propeller of a downed Japanese plane, the firing pin wouldn't jam on a direct hit. So by late 1943, after nearly 2 years of nothing but failure, the Mark 14 was finally fixed.
So, just pause for a second and picture this. You've got an entire submarine force of veteran crews. These guys have survived for 2 years using a broken weapon. They're absolute masters of stealth, of approach, of escape, because they had to be. And now you suddenly hand these hardened survivors a weapon that works perfectly, every single time. The result wasn't just an increase in sinkings, it was an absolute slaughter.
The numbers you're looking at here are the direct result of that fix. Just look at that jump. In 1944, with a working torpedo, the submarine force sank nearly 6 times more shipping than it had in 1942. The Japanese High Command, who had built their entire anti-sub strategy on the belief that American torpedoes were a joke, had absolutely no answer. The entire foundation of their strategy just crumbled right out from under them.
So this right here is the critical point. We all remember the big, famous carrier battles and the island invasions, but this chart shows the silent, hidden war that really decided the outcome. The U.S. submarine force made up less than 2% of the entire Navy, yet they sank nearly 55% of all Japanese ships lost in the war. That's more than all the planes, all the destroyers, all the battleships, all the mines combined.
You have to remember, Japan is an island nation. Its entire war machine ran on imported oil, imported steel, imported rubber, and imported food. The American submarines, now incredibly lethal and efficient, just systematically cut every single one of those arteries. They didn't just sink ships, they sank an entire economy. By 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy, one of the most powerful fleets ever built, was basically trapped in its own harbors. It couldn't even sail because it had no fuel. The Silent Service had imposed a silent blockade, and Japan was suffocating.
So, why does a story about a faulty torpedo from 80 years ago matter to any of us today? Because, like we said at the start, this is a blueprint. It's a timeless, crystal-clear case study in how we, and the places we work, deal with our own assumptions and the painful truth of failure. These aren't just little historical footnotes. They're huge warning signs.
Symmetrical arrogance is when you see your competitor struggling and think, they're idiots, instead of wondering what they're learning from their mistakes. Confirmation bias is the voice of the Bureau of Ordnance ignoring every single report from the front line because it contradicts their comfortable belief that we built it, so it must be perfect. But that last point is maybe the most powerful lesson here. Japan started the war with the better weapon, no question. The US started with a complete disaster. But the American ability to finally, and painfully, admit they had failed and then fix the system proved to be infinitely more powerful than Japan's initial head start.
And that brings us to the final, crushing irony of this whole thing. By 1944, Japan's technological marvel, the long-lance torpedo, was basically a weapon without a purpose. And why? Because the supposedly incompetent American submariners with their primitive torpedoes had already systematically wiped out the Japanese merchant fleet and crippled the Imperial Navy. There was literally nothing left for the world's best torpedo to shoot at. Japan won the battle of technology, but they lost the war of adaptation.
So, this whole blueprint leaves us with a challenge. The U.S. Navy dismissed Japanese tech as impossible. The Japanese dismissed American submariners as incompetent, and both of them paid an unimaginable price for being so certain they were right. So ask yourself, in your job, in your industry, in the way you look at the world, what's your long lance? What's the threat or the competitor or the idea you dismiss as impossible or incompetent just because it doesn't fit your model of how things work? This whole story is a powerful reminder that the most dangerous blind spot we have is always the one we refuse to believe is even there.